you have nowhere else to go, and honestly, that's not my problem anymore. That's what my own daughter said to me while two movers carried my furniture out to the curb. My name is Margaret Whitfield, and 3 days ago, my daughter Melissa evicted me from the house I raised her in. She thought she was finally free of her burden of a mother. She had no idea that my late husband left behind something that would change everything, including who really owned the roof over her head. If you're watching this, please subscribe. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. What happened over the next 2 weeks taught my daughter a lesson about respect that no amount of money could have bought her. Let me back up and tell you how Robert and I ended up on Maple Grove Lane in the first place, because none of what happened later makes sense without understanding what we built together. I met Robert Whitfield in the summer of 1985 at a church picnic in Springfield. He was 26, working as a junior technician for the county water department, making $14,000 a year, driving a rusted-out Chevy Nova that stalled at every red light. I was 24, a receptionist at a dentist's office. Neither of us had a dime to our name, but we had something a lot of couples I knew didn't have. We actually talked to each other, for hours, about everything. We got married in the spring of 1986 in my parents' backyard. 42 guests, a potluck reception, my mother's homemade punch, and a wedding dress I'd altered myself from a pattern, because the ones in the shop were $400 and we didn't have $400 to spare. Robert gave a toast that night that I still remember, word for word. I don't have much to offer Maggie except every single day for the rest of my life. He kept that promise for 38 years. We rented a 1-bedroom apartment on Elm Street for $310 a month for the first 4 years of our marriage. Robert worked his way up at the water department slowly. Junior technician, then supervisor by 1994. I picked up part-time work at the dentist's office, and later at a local elementary school as a teacher's aide, making maybe $9,000 a year on top of what Robert brought home. We saved everything we could. No vacations for the first 6 years. No new car. We ate leftovers until there was nothing left to eat. Melissa was born in 1990. I remember Robert holding her in the hospital, this exhausted, overjoyed look on his face, saying, "Maggie, we're going to give her everything we didn't have." That became the mission of our entire marriage from that point forward. Not luxury, but stability. A childhood without the fear that used to keep me up at night, growing up in a house where my own father lost his job twice. Before I turned 12, in 1998, after 12 years of marriage and careful saving, we finally had enough for a down payment on a house. $142,000 for a modest 3-bedroom colonial on Maple Grove Lane, built in 1962, with a leaky roof we didn't fix until 2003, and a kitchen we didn't renovate until 2011, one cabinet at a time, paid in cash as we could afford it. Robert did most of the work himself on weekends. I remember him up on a ladder at 54 years old, insisting he didn't need to hire anyone for gutters, when he could do it himself, and save $600. By the time Melissa graduated high school in 2008, Robert had been promoted to Regional Operations Manager at the Water Department, a modest but steady salary increase to about $58,000 a year. We paid for her state university tuition in full, no loans, because Robert refused to let his daughter start adult life already buried in debt, the way some of our friends' kids had. That's the whole point of everything we sacrificed, he told me once. So she doesn't have to. Robert retired in 2019 after 31 years with the water department, a modest pension of $1,850 a month, no golden parachute, no stock options, just 3 decades of quiet, reliable work. We thought that pension, our paid-off house, and whatever small savings we'd managed to put aside over the years, maybe $60,000, I assumed at the time, was going to carry us comfortably through our retirement. We talked about maybe taking a trip to see the Grand Canyon, something we'd promised each other back in 1986. And never quite gotten around to. What I didn't know, what Robert had been quietly building for nearly a decade, without telling me the full extent of it, was a series of small, careful investments. A rental property on Route 9 he'd purchased in 2011 after a modest inheritance from his own father, initially just to have a little something extra coming in. Contributions to a retirement account that thanks to nearly 30 years of compound growth, had quietly become worth far more than either of us discussed out loud. Robert was a man who believed money should be handled quietly, without fanfare, without pressure from anyone, including, as it would turn out, without full disclosure to his own daughter. Then 14 months ago, on an ordinary Tuesday morning in March, Robert had a heart attack while replacing a filter in the garage. No warning. No history of heart problems, fit as far as we both knew. I found him at 9:40 in the morning, and called 911, but the paramedics told me later there was likely nothing anyone could have done. It was sudden, and by the time I found him, he'd already been gone for several minutes. He was 67 years old, we'd been married 38 years, together for 39, the funeral was small, the way Robert would have wanted it. Melissa flew in from 3 states away, devastated, leaning on me more than I think either of us expected. For the first few months after he passed, grief consumed both of us in different ways. I moved through my days on autopilot, still setting 2 coffee cups out of habit some mornings before catching myself. Melissa, meanwhile, was dealing with her own crisis. She and Craig had been struggling financially for over a year, and losing her father seemed to accelerate something in her, a kind of desperation I didn't fully understand until months later. 8 months after Robert's funeral, Melissa called me in tears, saying she and Craig were 3 months behind on rent and didn't know what to do. Of course I told her to come stay with me. What kind of mother turns her own grieving daughter away? I had no idea that decision, made purely out of love, in one of the loneliest years of my life, would eventually lead to the morning 2 movers stood on my porch with my furniture in their hands. Melissa and Craig moved into the guest room. On a rainy Tuesday in November, 2 suitcases and a moving truck full of furniture we ended up storing in the garage because there simply wasn't room for it in a 3-bedroom house. "Just until we get back on our feet, Mom," Melissa told me, hugging me tight in the driveway. "Maybe 3 months, tops." I believed her, I wanted to believe her. Having her back under my roof, even under difficult circumstances, felt like a small mercy in a year that had otherwise been unbearably lonely. For the first few weeks, things were almost sweet. Melissa would sit with me some evenings, going through old photo albums, crying together over pictures of Robert at Melissa's high school graduation, at her wedding, holding her as a newborn. Craig, for his part, fixed a leaky faucet in the upstairs bathroom without being asked, and I remember thinking, this is what family is supposed to look like when things get hard. We eat dinner together most nights. I cooked, the way I always had, meatloaf on Mondays, Robert's favorite chicken and dumplings on Sundays, and for a little while it almost felt like healing, but 3 months came and went. Then 6. By month 5, I noticed something shifting in the way Melissa spoke to me, small things at first. The kind you tell yourself you're imagining. I misplaced my reading glasses one evening, a habit I'd had for 20 years, and Melissa sighed loudly from the couch. "Mom, you really need to start being more careful. You're not getting any younger, you know." I laughed it off at the time. A week later, I mentioned I might repaint the guest room a soft yellow, something cheerful, and Craig said, without looking up from his phone, "Not much point investing in this place long term, is there?" I asked him what he meant. He just shrugged and changed the subject. By month 6, the comments had a pattern. Craig started referring to my late husband's home office, the small room where Robert used to do his crossword puzzles and pay bills, as the room will turn into a nursery eventually. He said it in front of me, at the dinner table, like it was already decided, like I was a guest in my own home rather than the woman who'd lived there for 26 years. Melissa would sometimes catch his tone and give him a look, but she never corrected him. She never once said, "Craig, that's not decision to make." Then came the conversation about the house's value. I overheard Melissa on the phone with a friend one evening, standing in the backyard where she thought I couldn't hear her through the kitchen window. "Craig looked it up, Sarah. Comparable houses on this street have gone for over $300,000. If we could just get Mom to downsize into something smaller, we'd finally have some breathing room." I stood at that sink for a long time after that call ended, feeling something cold settle into my stomach that I didn't have a name for yet. The small digs kept coming after that, dressed up as concern. "Mom, Have you thought about how you'll manage the stairs when you're older? Don't you think this house is a lot of upkeep for one person? Wouldn't it be easier for everyone if you didn't have to worry about all this space? Every comment sounded reasonable on its own. Together they formed a pattern I recognized but didn't want to admit I was seeing: my daughter and her husband slowly, methodically building a case for why I shouldn't be living in my own home. What hurt most wasn't Craig, if I'm honest. I expected less from a son-in-law I'd only known for 6 years. What hurt was watching my daughter, the little girl Robert and I had sacrificed everything to raise well, sit at that table, and let those comments happen without a word in my defense. Sometimes she'd even nod along. Craig has a point, Mom, I kept telling myself. Grief does strange things to people, that Melissa was still hurting over her father, that financial stress can make even good people say things they don't mean. I held on to that excuse longer than I probably should have, because the alternative, that my own daughter was quietly counting down the days until I was out of her way, was something I wasn't ready to accept. Not yet. Not until the folder appeared on my kitchen table, 3 weeks later. The folder appeared on a Thursday evening in late September. I remember the date because it was 2 days before what would have been Robert's and my 39th wedding anniversary. Melissa asked me to sit down at the kitchen table, the same table where Robert used to do the crossword every Sunday morning, and she slid a manila folder across to me like she was presenting a business proposal. Inside were printed brochures for 3 different senior living communities: Willowbrook Estates, Cedar Pines, and something called Golden Years Manor, all starting at $3,200 a month, all glossy photographs of smiling gray-haired strangers playing bingo in rooms that looked nothing like the home I'd built with my husband. Mom, Craig and I have been talking, she said, not quite meeting my eyes. We really think it's time to start considering some options. This house is a lot for one person, and honestly, it doesn't make sense for it to just sit here half empty when there are better living situations for you and better uses for the equity. I remember staring at those brochures for a long moment before I found my voice. Melissa, this is my home. Your father and I raised you in this house. I'm not ready to leave it. Her expression hardened in a way I hadn't seen since she was a stubborn teenager. This isn't really just your decision anymore, Mom. Dad's estate technically went to both of us. I looked into it. I have rights here too. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I tried to talk to her calmly over coffee, reminding her that her father and I had built that home together over 26 years, that it wasn't a line item on a spreadsheet, it was where I still felt him in every room. She listened, or seemed to, and for about a week things quieted down. I let myself believe the crisis had passed. It hadn't. 10 days later, Craig came home from work with news that his hours were being cut back at the dealership, a $400 a month hit to their income on top of the credit card debt I later learned they'd been carrying, close to $22,000 between 2 cards. That same week, Melissa stopped speaking to me almost entirely, except for logistics, whose turn it was to walk the dog, whether I'd started dinner yet. The warmth that had briefly returned after Robert's anniversary evaporated completely, replaced by a tension so thick I started eating dinner in my room some nights just to avoid the silence at the table. Then came the incident with the car. My 2009 Camry needed a $380 repair for the transmission, and when I mentioned it, Craig laughed, not unkindly exactly, but in a way that stung. Honestly, Margaret, at some point you have to ask if it's worth throwing good money after bad. Maybe it's time to think bigger picture. I didn't understand what he meant by bigger picture until Melissa clarified it for me a few nights later. Mom, we've been thinking. What if we just simplified everything? You move somewhere smaller and more manageable, we sell the house, split the proceeds the way Dad's will says, and everyone gets a fresh start. Craig and I could finally get out from under this debt and you wouldn't have to worry about maintenance and property taxes anymore. I told her, as gently as I could, that I wasn't ready, that this wasn't just a financial decision to me, that I needed time. That's when her patience seemed to run out entirely. Mom, we don't really have time. Craig's job situation isn't stable. We need to figure this out now, not whenever you feel emotionally ready. I remember feeling, for the first time in my life, genuinely afraid of my own daughter, not physically, but afraid of what she might do if I kept saying no. 2 days later, I came home from the grocery store to find Melissa and Craig in what used to be Robert's office, tape measure in hand, discussing paint colors for what Craig again referred to as the nursery. They hadn't asked, they hadn't even mentioned they were thinking about having children yet, not to me, their own grandmother. It felt less like a family conversation and more like a hostile takeover of a business I happened to be living inside of. The eviction notice appeared exactly 9 days after that. Sitting on the kitchen counter in a formal envelope, prepared by an attorney from Craig's company's corporate legal team, a firm that normally handled commercial lease disputes. 30 days, it said, clinically, with a legal citation I didn't understand and a signature line at the bottom. Melissa didn't even hand it to me herself. I found it while looking for a pen to write a grocery list, and I stood in my own kitchen, reading a legal document, informing me I had 30 days to vacate the home my husband and I had spent 26 years paying off, one mortgage payment, one weekend repair, one careful sacrifice at a time. My hands were shaking so badly I had to sit down. That night, for the first time since Robert died, I opened the drawer in his old desk and pulled out the manila envelope he'd shown me. 6 months before he passed away, the one I'd prayed I would never actually need to open. I need to take you back, 6 months before Robert died, to a Sunday afternoon, in September, that I didn't fully understand the weight of until much later. Robert had asked me to sit with him in his office. The same room Craig and Melissa were now measuring for paint. He'd been unusually quiet that whole week. And I remember thinking he seemed tired, though I chalked it up to his age rather than anything more serious. He pulled a thick manila envelope out of the bottom drawer of his desk, the same drawer where he kept old tax returns and warranty cards for appliances we'd long since replaced. "Maggie, I need to show you something," he said, "and I need you to really listen, not just nod along the way you sometimes do when I talk business." That got my attention, because Robert rarely used that tone with me. He opened the envelope and laid out a series of documents across the desk: deed paperwork, something labeled, Family Protection Trust Agreement, and a business card for an estate attorney named Daniel Ferris, whose office was almost 2 hours away in the city, someone I'd never even heard Robert mention before. "About 2 years ago," he explained, "I moved the house, the rental property on Route 9, and most of our investment accounts into a trust. You're the trustee, Maggie, and the sole beneficiary while you're alive. That means nobody, not the bank, not a lawsuit, not even our own daughter, can touch any of it without your signature." I remember asking him why on earth he'd done something like that without discussing it with me first. Half amused, half confused, his answer stopped me cold. "Because I watched what happened to my brother Daniel, 3 years before he died. His own son and daughter-in-law convinced him to sign the house over, to make things simpler, and within 18 months they had him in a facility and were renting out his old bedroom. I promised myself that would never happen to you, Maggie, no matter how much I trust Melissa right now. People change when money and desperation get involved. I've seen it too many times at the water department, co-workers, neighbors, folks I grew up with." At the time, I remember feeling almost defensive on Melissa's behalf. "Robert, she would never do something like that to me." He didn't argue with me, he just said quietly, "I hope you're right. But hope isn't a plan, Maggie, this is a plan. If I'm wrong about her, you'll never need any of this, and it'll just sit there quietly doing nothing. But if I'm right, even a little bit right, you'll thank me for it." He made me memorize Daniel Ferris's phone number that afternoon. Had me repeat it back to him twice, and made me promise that if anything ever felt wrong, if anyone ever pressured me about the house or the money, I would call that number before I signed anything. Before I agreed to anything, before I even discussed it further with whoever was pressuring me, I filed that conversation away, the way you file away a fire extinguisher, grateful it exists, quietly hoping you'll never actually need to use it. When Robert passed 4 months later, I was so consumed by grief, that the trust paperwork barely crossed my mind except as one more piece of estate business Mr. Ferris handled quietly and professionally in the background. I signed what needed signing, filed what needed filing, and didn't think much more about the specifics, the exact dollar figures, the rental property income, any of it. I trusted Robert had set it up correctly, and grief has a way of making even important details feel distant and unreal. The night the eviction notice, counter, I sat alone at that same desk, where Robert had once spread out his documents, and I opened that same drawer. The envelope was still there, exactly where he'd left it. I read through the trust agreement slowly, this time really reading it, not just half listening the way I had that Sunday afternoon 2 years earlier. Section by section, I began to understand exactly what my husband had quietly built to protect me: the house, valued now at over $300,000, a commercial rental property on Route 9, generating steady monthly income, investment accounts that had grown considerably over 3 decades of careful, patient saving, and there, in Section 4, Paragraph 2, a clause I hadn't paid attention to before: any beneficiary who attempted to force the trustee from her primary residence would forfeit their remaining interest in the trust entirely. My hands were still shaking, but, for a different reason now, I picked up the phone and dialed the number Robert had made me memorize 2 years earlier. It rang twice. Ferris and Associates. Mr. Ferris, I said, my voice steadier than I expected. This is Margaret Whitfield. I think it's time we talked. Moving day arrived exactly as Melissa had planned it, a crisp Saturday morning in late October, 30 days almost to the hour since that eviction notice appeared on my kitchen counter. I woke early, before either of them stirred, and made myself a cup of coffee at the same counter, where I'd read that legal document a month earlier. By 8 a.m., a moving truck was already idling in the driveway, and by 8:30, 2 movers Craig had hired were carrying boxes out of my bedroom, boxes I hadn't packed myself. I later realized Melissa had gone through my closet the evening before. While I was at church, Melissa stood on the front porch with a clipboard, directing the movers with the brisk efficiency of someone running a small logistics operation rather than removing her own mother from her home of 26 years. Mom, the movers just need you to point out which boxes are yours, versus which ones are staying with the house, she said, not quite looking at me, the same way she hadn't quite looked at me the night the folder first appeared on that kitchen table. Craig would cheer his brother's pickup truck in the driveway, arms crossed, already discussing with his brother where they'd start unloading once they got to the small apartment they'd apparently already selected for me, one I'd never even seen, let alone approved. I remember standing on my own front lawn at 9:15 that morning, watching strangers carry furniture Robert and I had chosen together over 3 decades out to a curb, feeling something I can only describe as a strange, hollow calm settle over me. I had called Mr. Ferris the moment the movers arrived, at 8:05, and he'd told me simply, "Mrs. Whitfield, stay calm, don't sign anything, and don't argue with anyone, I'll be there within the hour." True to his word, at exactly 9:20, a gray sedan pulled slowly into the driveway, and a tall man in a gray suit stepped out, carrying a slim leather briefcase. Melissa noticed him first, her clipboard lowering slightly as she watched him approach the porch with the calm, unhurried confidence of a man who had done this exact kind of thing many times before. "Mrs. Whitfield asked me to stop by this morning," he said pleasantly, extending a hand toward Melissa, who shook it automatically, clearly unsure who she was even greeting. "I'm Daniel Ferris, Robert Whitfield's estate attorney. I understand there might be some confusion this morning about the ownership of this particular property." Craig walked over from the driveway at that point, his brother, trailing a few steps behind, both of them wearing the same confused expression Melissa now had. "I'm sorry, who exactly are you?" Craig asked, his tone somewhere between polite and defensive. "I represent the trust that currently holds title to this house," Mr. Ferris said, still perfectly calm, opening his briefcase against the porch railing. I thought it might save everyone some time and inconvenience this morning if we clarified a few details before any more of Mrs. Whitfield's furniture ends up on the curb." Melissa's face had gone from businesslike to visibly uncertain in the span of about 10 seconds. "What trust?" "Dad's will said the estate went to me and Mom, 50-50, that's what our attorney told us." Mr. Ferris nodded patiently, the way I imagine he'd nodded at dozens of surprised beneficiaries over his career. "The will you're referring to covers your father's personal accounts, I'll get to in a moment. But this property, 214 Maple Grove Lane, has not been part of your father's personal estate for over 2 years now." He pulled the first document out of his briefcase and laid it flat on the porch railing, where all four of us, Melissa, Craig, his brother, and one of the two movers who'd stopped mid-carry to watch, could see it clearly. This house belongs to the Robert and Margaret Whitfield Family Protection Trust. And as I'm about to explain, that changes quite a bit about how this morning is going to go. Mr. Ferris laid out the documents one at a time on the porch railing, methodically, the way I imagine he'd done in courtrooms and conference rooms for 30 years, letting each piece of information settle before moving to the next. Let's start with the property itself, he said, tapping the first document. 214 Maple Grove Lane was transferred into the Robert and Margaret Whitfield Family Protection Trust on March 14, 2022. Current appraised value, as of last month's assessment, $318,000. Mrs. Whitfield here is the sole trustee and sole lifetime beneficiary of this trust. That means, in plain terms, she has complete and exclusive legal authority over this property, full stop, regardless of what your father's separate will might say about his other assets. Melissa's clipboard had lowered entirely to her side now, forgotten. That's not possible, she said, her voice smaller than I'd heard it in years. Dad's will said everything split 50-50 between me and Mom. Our attorney reviewed it. He never mentioned any trust. Your father's will, Mr. Ferris said patiently, covers his personal estate, which I'll get to momentarily. This property was deliberately moved outside of that will 2 years before he passed, specifically, so it would never become part of any probate dispute. That's a fairly common estate planning strategy, Mrs. I'm sorry, I don't believe I caught your name. Melissa, she said, barely audible. He continued, pulling a second document from his briefcase. Now, regarding your father's personal estate, which does pass through the will you mentioned, as of the most recent accounting, that estate includes $760,000 across 2 investment accounts, accumulated over approximately 28 years of contributions and market growth. Craig actually made a small sound, something between a cough and a gasp, and took an involuntary step backward, nearly bumping into his brother. $760,000, he repeated. There's also this, Mr. Ferris continued, unbothered, pulling a third document, a commercial rental property on Route 9, purchased outright in 2011, currently leased to a tire and auto shop, generating $4,200 a month in rental income, which, again, flows into the trust structure I mentioned, not directly to either of you. I watched my daughter's face as these numbers landed, one after another, watched decades of assumptions about her modest, coupon-clipping mother, and her quiet, water department father crumble in real time on our own front porch. Mom, she said, turning to me for the first time that morning. Did you know about all of this? I told her the truth. Some of it. Your father showed me the trust paperwork about 6 months before he passed. I didn't fully understand the numbers until last night, if I'm honest. He handled money quietly. That was always his way. Mr. Ferris cleared his throat gently, the way I imagine he did when he needed to redirect a room back to business. There's one more section I think everyone here needs to hear, particularly given this morning's circumstances. He pulled out a fourth document, the trust agreement itself, and turned to a specific page he'd clearly flagged, in advance. Section 4, Paragraph 2. I'll read it exactly as written. Should any beneficiary named herein attempt to coerce, pressure, or legally compel the trustee to vacate her primary residence during her lifetime, that beneficiary's remaining interest in this trust shall be immediately and permanently forfeited. The porch went completely silent except for the idling engine of the moving truck still parked at the curb. I should mention, Mr. Ferris added, almost as an afterthought, though I suspect it was anything but, that the eviction filing your attorney submitted 3 weeks ago has already been entered as evidence in this matter. Along with, I believe, several text messages your mother forwarded to me last night, discussing the sale of this property, and I believe the phrase used was better use of the equity. Melissa's eyes went wide, clearly trying to remember every message she'd ever sent Craig about the house, the pension, the equity, every casual comment she'd made, assuming her mother would never see them, would never understand the implications, would simply comply the way she'd complied with almost everything, for the past 8 months out of grief and loneliness, and a desperate hope that her daughter, the way she used to. Craig. To his credit, was the first to try to salvage something. "Look, I think there's been a misunderstanding here. We were never trying to force anyone out permanently. We just thought, given the financial pressure we've been under." Mr. Ferris cut him off politely but firmly. "I understand there's context here I'm not fully aware of, and that's not really my concern this morning. My concern is simply making sure everyone understands the legal reality of this property and this trust before anything further happens on this lawn. Mrs. Whitfield asked me to be here to clarify that reality. I've done so." He closed his briefcase with a soft click that somehow felt louder than everything that had been said in the previous 10 minutes. I looked at the two movers, still standing awkwardly near the truck, clearly unsure whether they were still employed for the morning or not. "I'd like my furniture brought back inside, please," I said, my voice steadier than I expected it to be. The older of the two movers nodded immediately, almost with relief, and turned to his partner. "All right, let's get this stuff back where it came from." Craig's brother, who had said nothing this entire time, quietly walked to his pickup truck, unhooked the small utility trailer he'd brought along, and drove off without a word to anyone. Melissa stood frozen on her own front porch, clipboard now hanging loosely at her side, watching 2 decades of quiet, careful financial planning she'd never known existed, unravel an entire eviction plan in under 15 minutes. The days following that Saturday morning unfolded with a kind of quiet, cascading consequence that I never actually orchestrated, but that seemed to follow naturally once the truth was finally out in the open. By Sunday evening, word had already reached Craig's mother, Diane, a woman I'd always gotten along with well enough at holidays, but had never been particularly close to. She called Melissa directly, and though I only heard Melissa's side of the conversation from the next room, it was clear Diane was furious. She and her husband had quietly loaned Craig and Melissa $18,000 over the previous year, money they'd explained away as helping with a rough patch, money Diane had apparently believed was being repaid gradually through the anticipated proceeds of my house sale. Diane wanted her money back immediately, and she wanted it in writing. By Monday morning, the real estate agent Melissa had already been in contact with, a woman named Patricia Hollis from a local agency, called the house looking for an update on getting things ready for photos. I answered the phone myself, and after a rather uncomfortable few minutes of explanation, Patricia admitted she'd already begun quietly marketing the property to 2 interested buyers on a coming soon pre-market basis, standard practice, she assured me, though it was news to me that my home had been informally shopped around before I'd even agreed to sell it. She apologized profusely, and promised to pull any reference to the property immediately. Tuesday brought a call from Craig's employer, unrelated to the house directly, but the timing felt almost poetic. His hours, already reduced the month before, were cut further, part of a broader restructuring at the dealership that had nothing to do with our family situation, but landed at the worst possible moment for 2 people who'd just lost access to $760,000 and a $318 Zuzod house they'd spent the better part of a year quietly counting on. Melissa later told me that Wednesday night, she and Craig had their first real argument. In front of her, not about me, but about each other. About decisions made, about whose idea it had really been to push things as far as they had, about whether Craig's constant comments about the master suite and the nursery had poisoned what should have been a simple, temporary living arrangement into something neither of them could take back. By the following weekend, Melissa's oldest friend Sarah, the same friend I'd overheard her talking to in the backyard months earlier about comparable home values on our street, stopped calling as often. I don't know exactly what was said between them, but Melissa mentioned once, almost in passing, that Sarah had said something to the effect of, "I never thought you'd actually go through with something like that to your own mother." Whatever validation Melissa had been building toward, whatever justification she'd constructed in her mind over the previous 8 months, seemed to collapse under the simple, quiet judgment of people who'd known her far longer than any financial pressure had existed. The hardest part to watch, honestly, wasn't Craig's job or Diane's anger or the real estate listing that had to be quietly retracted. It was watching my daughter sit at our kitchen table, 3 days after that Saturday morning, staring at her phone, scrolling through months of text messages between her and Craig, messages about equity and downsizing and better uses of space, seeing them, I think, for the first time, the way an outside observer, the way I, would have seen them. I didn't say anything to her that afternoon. I simply made 2 cups of tea, the way I used to when she was small, and, upset about something at school, and set one down quietly in front of her. She didn't drink it right away, she just stared at it for a long time, and I recognized, watching her, the particular kind of silence that comes right before someone finally admits, at least to themselves, that they've made a terrible mistake. It was almost 2 weeks after that Saturday morning, before Melissa finally sat down with me properly. No clipboard, no folder of brochures, no Craig standing nearby measuring rooms for renovations. That would never happen. She came alone on a Tuesday afternoon, while Craig was at a job interview across town, a fresh start he'd been pursuing, since the dealership cut his hours further. I was in the kitchen making soup. Something simple. Chicken and rice, the kind of thing I used to make when she was small and homesick from school, and she stood in the doorway for a long moment before speaking. "Mom, can we talk?" Really talk, not like before. I turned off the stove and gestured toward the table, the same table where the brochures had first appeared, where the eviction notice had first been read, where so much damage had quietly accumulated over the past 8 months. She sat down across from me, and for a long moment neither of us said anything. Finally, she spoke. "I don't even know how to start apologizing for what I did. I keep replaying that morning in my head, the movers, the clipboard, standing there directing people to carry your furniture out, like you were, I don't know, cargo instead of my mother." I let her talk. I'd learned enough from Robert over 38 years of marriage, to know that sometimes, the most helpful thing you can do, is simply, create space, for someone to say the truth out loud, rather than rushing to fill silence with forgiveness they haven't fully earned yet. "I think losing Dad broke something in me that I didn't want to admit," she continued, her voice unsteady. "I was so scared, Mom. Craig and I were drowning in debt, and somewhere in my grief I convinced myself that fixing the money problem would fix everything, that if we could just get access to the house, to whatever Dad left behind, all of it would go away. The fear, the stress, the feeling like I was failing at my own life, and it was so much easier to see you as an obstacle to that fix, than to actually sit with how much I was hurting." I nodded slowly. "Your father used to say something similar, actually, about how desperation changes people, even good people, even people who love each other very much." She looked up at me sharply. "He knew, about me, about this happening?" "He didn't know specifically," I said carefully, "but he'd watched it happen to his own brother, years ago, with different people, similar circumstances. That's part of why he set up the trust the way he did. Not because he distrusted you specifically, Melissa, but because he understood that grief and money and fear can make people do things they'd never do under normal circumstances." She was quiet for a long time after that, turning her mug of tea, slowly, in her hands. "I keep thinking about that day on the porch," she finally said, "watching that lawyer lay out everything Dad had built, quietly, for years, without either of us knowing. And all I could think in that moment wasn't even about the money, honestly. It was realizing how little I'd actually let myself know about my own father in his final years. I was so busy, assuming I understood our financial situation, that I never once asked him what he was actually planning, what he was actually building for us. And then I did the same thing to you, assumed I understood your situation without ever really asking." We talked for almost 3 hours that afternoon. Longer than we'd talked, really talked, since before Robert's funeral. About grief. About how differently it had hit each of us. About the specific loneliness of losing a father you'd never fully appreciated, while he was alive to be appreciated. About the specific loneliness, on my end, of losing a husband of 38 years, while also watching my only daughter slowly become someone I didn't quite recognize. She cried at one point, real tears. Not the frustrated tears of someone caught in a lie, but something that felt more like grief finally being allowed to surface the way it should have 8 months earlier, before financial panic had buried it under spreadsheets and real estate brochures. Before she left that evening, she hugged me at the front door, the same door the movers had carried furniture through 2 weeks earlier, and she said something I'll remember for the rest of my life. "I don't expect you to trust me again right away, Mom. I know that has to be earned back slowly. But I want you to know I see you now, not the house, not the money, just you, my mom, who's been alone and grieving this whole time while I was too scared and too selfish to notice. It wasn't a complete repair, not that afternoon, not for many afternoons after. But it was, finally, a genuine beginning. 6 months have passed since that Saturday morning on the porch, and life at 214 Maple Grove Lane has settled into something quieter, more honest than it had been in the year before Robert died. Melissa and Craig moved into a small apartment across town in December, modest, 2 bedrooms, built entirely on their own combined income, no help from the trust, no expectation of it. Craig eventually found steady work at a different dealership, not as high-paying as before, but stable, and something about starting over from a place of honesty rather than desperation seems to have settled him in a way I hadn't seen in years. Melissa calls me now, actually calls, not just texts about logistics. 3 or 4 times a week, and comes by most Sundays, sometimes with Craig, sometimes alone. We've slowly rebuilt something that resembles what we had before Robert died, not identical to it. Grief changes a relationship permanently in ways you can't fully undo, but real, and rooted now in something sturdier than it was before. Last month, after nearly 6 months of watching her rebuild her finances honestly, paying down the credit card debt, one careful payment at a time the way her father and I once paid down our own mortgage, I released $50,000 from the trust to help her and Craig, with a down payment, on a small, starter home of their own. I didn't do it because I had to. The trust gave me complete discretion, and after everything that happened, no one, not Mr. Ferris, not Craig's mother Diane, certainly not me, would have blamed me for holding on to every dollar for the rest of my life. I did it because trust, once it's honestly rebuilt, deserves to be met halfway. Melissa cried when I told her, not the desperate tears of someone hoping for a bailout, but something quieter and more grateful, the tears of someone who understood exactly what was being extended to her. A second chance she knew she hadn't fully earned yet, but was finally being trusted to grow into. I still live in this house, the one Robert and I paid off one careful sacrifice at a time, the one he quietly protected years before either of us imagined I'd ever need that protection. Some mornings I still set out 2 coffee cups, before catching myself. Old habits. 38 years of marriage don't disappear just because the person is gone. But I've stopped feeling like a burden in my own home, the way Melissa and Craig, in their fear and financial panic, briefly made me feel like one. I understand now, in a way I didn't fully understand while Robert was alive, exactly why he did what he did, quietly, without asking my permission, without making a show of it. He wasn't protecting the house or the money, he was protecting the version of me that might one day be too grieving, too trusting, too eager, to keep peace with my own daughter, to protect myself. Robert used to say that boundaries aren't walls, meant to keep the people you love out, they're fences meant to make sure love never gets confused with convenience, or desperation, or fear. My daughter finally understands the difference between those things now, the hard way, the way most of us end up learning our most important lessons. And I finally understand that even after 38 years of marriage, even after he was gone, my husband was still, quietly and without fanfare, taking care of me exactly the way he'd promised he would. On the day we got married in my parents' backyard, for every single day, even the ones after his own.